She was pushing a cleaning cart through a marble corridor when he stopped her. A man in a Milan-cut suit, a pocket square pressed to geometric perfection. Two assistants trailing behind him like shadows that had learned to walk upright. He looked at her the way certain people look at furniture, registering presence without registering person. She was a black woman in a maid's uniform, hair pinned up, head slightly lowered. Invisible by design. The cart had barely grazed his trouser leg. No mark, no damage. Nothing that any reasonable person would have noticed. He noticed. "You touched my suit," he said. Cold. Certain. The voice of a man who has never once in his life been told he was wrong. "Maids like you should watch where you're going. That's the only thing you're here for." She looked at him. Not with anger, not with fear. With something far more dangerous than either. A patience that knew something he didn't. "I apologize, sir," she said quietly. And she walked away. He watched her go and felt, for just one fraction of 1 second, that the floor was slightly lower than he expected. He ignored it, fixed his pocket square, stepped into the elevator. He was on his way to the penthouse to beg the most feared man in Seoul for protection. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have imagined in 1,000 lifetimes, was that the woman he had just dismissed in that corridor, that black woman in that uniform pushing that cart, was the most powerful person in the entire building. And the Korean Mafia boss he was going to meet was her husband. Before starting the story, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of karma, love, and hidden truths move you, leave a like. Be sure to subscribe to the channel and click join to become a member and help our channel. There is a particular kind of silence that only exists in places where enormous amounts of money have been spent to make noise disappear. The Park Hanam residential complex in Seoul breathed exactly that kind of silence. 42 floors of dark glass and imported stone, rising above the Han River like a monument to the idea that some people simply do not share the same air as others. The carpets in the corridors were so thick they absorbed footsteps entirely. The elevators opened without a sound. Even the air, recycled, filtered, cooled to a precise 16 degrees Celsius year-round, seemed to have been purged of anything ordinary. It was the kind of building where people did not look at each other in the hallways. Not out of rudeness. Out of an unspoken agreement that the truly powerful protect their privacy by extending that same courtesy to everyone around them. You did not look. You did not ask. You moved through the space like a current through still water. Present, functional, and invisible. Celine Adeze Okafor understood this better than anyone who lived there. She had studied it, in fact. The invisibility of service. The specific way that wealth trains itself not to see the people who maintain it. The precise angle at which a person carrying cleaning supplies must tilt their head so that the human eye, trained by decades of class instinct, simply slides past. It was not degrading to her. It was, in its own particular way, a masterclass in power. Because the people in that building, senators, executives, men whose names moved markets, believed themselves to be the most perceptive individuals in any room they entered. And not one of them had ever truly seen her. She moved down the 41st floor corridor that Tuesday morning the way she always moved. Unhurried, the cleaning cart rolling smoothly ahead of her, the faint chemical scent of the polish she used on the baseboards trailing behind like a signature. Her hair was pinned up, the single golden clip catching the corridor light for just a moment before she turned the corner. Her uniform was immaculate. Her posture was the posture of a woman who had made a deliberate choice about how she wanted the world to read her. and who understood, with complete clarity, that the world's misreading was her greatest asset. What no one in that building knew, what no one outside a circle of 7 people in the entire city of Seoul knew, was that the woman pushing the cleaning cart had, 18 months earlier, restructured the financial backbone of the most feared criminal organization in South Korea. She had done it from a rented office in Zurich under a name that appeared nowhere in any public record. She had done it in 4 months, using a network of contacts that had taken her a decade to build across 3 continents. And she had done it because the man she loved had asked her quietly, one evening over cold barley tea on the floor of a half-furnished apartment, if she would help him save something he had inherited and did not entirely want, but could not walk away from. She had said yes. She had always been going to say yes. But that was not the story the 41st floor corridor knew. The corridor knew her as the quiet one, the thorough one, the one who never left a smudge on the glass panels. It was into this silence that Kwon Tae-sung arrived. He came through the main lobby at 11:43 in the morning, with the energy of a man who had never once in his life waited for anything. Not a table at a restaurant, not a response to an email, not the acknowledgement of a person he considered beneath him. He wore a navy suit that had been cut by hands in Milan, and a pocket square so precisely folded it appeared to have been pressed by machine. His hair was fixed with the kind of gel that leaves no evidence of itself, only a result. Behind him, 2 assistants moved in his wake like satellites, their eyes fixed on their devices, their mouths slightly open, ready to speak the moment he required them. He was, by every metric his world used to measure such things, impressive. He was the son of Minister Kwon Byung-chol, whose influence over the infrastructure contracts of 3 major Korean cities had been so durable and so total that it had long since ceased to be discussed in polite company. Not because it was scandalous, but because it had simply become part of the architecture of how things worked. Taesong had inherited the name, the connections, and the absolute certainty that came with both. He had not, by most accounts, inherited his father's patience, or his father's instinct for reading rooms. He was here because he needed something. That was the fact that his posture and his pocket square and his Milan-cut suit were designed to obscure. That Kwon Tae-sung, for all his inherited weight, was in a position of vulnerability. The family's political protection had been quietly eroding for 3 years. A series of contracts that should have been automatic had gone to other firms. 2 allies had retired without naming successors loyal to the Kwon name. And somewhere in the machinery of Korean power, someone had decided that the Kwon family's umbrella was worth less than it used to be. Taesong had been sent, though no one would ever use that word, to negotiate a new arrangement with the organization that occupied the building's most protected floor. He did not think about any of this as he crossed the lobby. He thought about the meeting, about the impression he intended to make, about the way he would sit and the way he would speak, and the specific quality of authority he would project. He did not think about the woman he passed in the corridor on the way to the elevator. She was coming around the corner from the east wing, the cleaning cart moving smoothly, her head at that precise angle, the golden clip catching the light for exactly as long as it took him to almost walk into her. He stopped, looked down. The cart had grazed the pressed crease of his left trouser leg. A whisper of contact. Nothing visible, nothing transferable. The fabric had not wrinkled. The crease was intact. Any person with functional eyesight and a calm temperament would have registered this, concluded there was no damage, and continued walking. Kwon Tae-sung was not, in that moment, possessed of a calm temperament. Hey. The word landed in the corridor the way a hand slaps a table. Not loud. He did not need to be loud, but waited with the absolute expectation of a response. The kind of word that had, his entire life, produced an immediate reorganization of whoever he aimed it at. She stopped, turned, and she looked at him. This was the detail that none of the three people who witnessed what followed would be able to fully articulate afterward, though each of them tried. It was not that she looked at him with contempt. It was not that she looked at him with defiance. It was something far more unsettling for a man in Kwon Tae-sung's position. She looked at him with patience, as though she had been expecting something exactly like this for a long time, and had long since decided how she would respond to it, and had found the whole thing, in the end, more interesting than threatening. "You touched my suit." She did not look at the suit. She continued looking at him. "That costs more than you'll make here in a year." One of the assistants glanced up from his phone. The other one did not. "Maids like you should watch where you're going." He said it the way someone states a fact about weather, without heat, which made it worse. "That's the only thing you're here for." There was a pause that lasted perhaps 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, anyone watching might have expected a variety of responses. An apology, a deferential lowering of the eyes, a stumbled explanation. The corridor offered all of these as possibilities. What it received was a slight tilt of the head, the faintest curve at the corner of the mouth. Not a smile. Not quite. Something that lived in the architecture of a smile without committing to it. "I apologize, sir." The voice was even, low, unhurried. The voice of someone who had chosen, very deliberately, the exact words she wanted to use, and no others. And then she turned back to the cart and continued down the corridor. Tae-sung watched her go for a moment, and in that moment, something he could not name and would not have admitted to passed through him. Not guilt, not quite. Something more like the brief sensation of having reached for a step in the dark and found the floor 2 inches lower than expected. He shook it off, fixed his pocket square, continued toward the elevator. Behind him, at the far end of the corridor, the security officer stationed near the stairwell door reached for the radio clipped to his shoulder. He pressed the transmit button once, said nothing, waited. The response came in 3 seconds. A single word in Korean. Understood. The officer released the button and returned to his position, face neutral, eyes forward. The elevator doors opened. Kwon Tae-sung stepped inside. The doors closed behind him without a sound, and the corridor returned to its silence. Thick, expensive, and now, in ways that Tae-sung could not yet feel, irreversibly altered. The 42nd floor did not appear on the building's public directory. This was not an oversight. The directory in the lobby, a sleek panel of brushed steel beside the concierge desk, listing residents by floor number and unit code, skipped from 41 to the roof access notation with the kind of seamless formatting that suggested nothing had been omitted. A person looking for a gap would not find one. The eye moved past it the way the eye moves past the space between words, registering the meaning, missing the absence. The elevator, however, knew the floor existed. If you had the right card, a matte black rectangle with no text, no logo, no visible chip, you pressed it flat against the interior panel where a 40-second button would have been, and the elevator recognized it. The floor number appeared briefly on the small display above the doors, and then disappeared as the car began to rise. By the time the doors opened, the display showed nothing at all. Kwon Tae-sung did not have the black card. He was taken to a different floor, the 38th, which contained a meeting suite maintained for exactly this kind of arranged conversation. The suite was tasteful in the way that expensive neutrality always is. Dark walnut panels, low lighting, a table that could seat 12 but had been set for 4. A tray of tea sat at the center, untouched. The windows looked east, toward the river, which was moving slowly in the afternoon light, like something that had long since stopped being in a hurry. A man was already seated when Tae-sung entered. Middle-aged, wire-rimmed glasses, the unremarkable quality of someone professionally trained to be forgotten. He introduced himself as a building administrator and offered Tae-sung a seat with the particular warmth of a person who is performing warmth rather than feeling it. Tae-sung settled into the chair across from him, adjusted his pocket square, and placed both hands flat on the table. A gesture he had practiced, a gesture that said, "I am a man who does not fidget, because I am a man who does not worry." "We understand the Kwon family is looking to establish a more permanent presence in this complex," the administrator said. "A working office, one of the commercial units on the upper floors." Tae-sung's voice was even, well-rehearsed. "My father's operations require a discreet location. We believe the association with this building would be mutually beneficial." The administrator nodded slowly, as though this were interesting rather than anticipated. What neither man acknowledged, because acknowledging it directly would have been a breach of the particular etiquette that governed these meetings, was what the arrangement actually meant. The Kwon family did not want office space. They wanted proximity. They wanted to be able to say, in the rooms where such things were said, that they maintained a relationship with the organization that controlled this building. That kind of adjacency had a value that could not be listed on a property deed, but was, in certain circles, worth considerably more than the real estate itself. What Tae-sung had been sent to buy, in other words, was protection dressed in the language of real estate. The administrator poured tea, asked several questions about timeline, about intended usage, about the specific floors that interested the Kwon family. Tae-sung answered with the measured confidence of a man performing an audition he believes he has already passed. And then, in the way that conversations sometimes shift not because someone decides to shift them, but because the weight of what is not being said finally tips the balance, the administrator removed his glasses, set them on the table, and asked a question that did not belong to the script either man had been following. "You mentioned one of our staff members in the corridor earlier." Tae-sung blinked. Once. The gesture of a man recalibrating. "A passing comment," he said. The cart came into contact with my suit. It was a minor... Yes." The administrator said the word with no edge and no warmth. Simply, yes. As though Tae-sung had answered a question he had not actually been asked. A silence followed that was 2 or 3 seconds too long to be comfortable. Tae-sung reached for his tea, drank, set the cup down. "I wasn't aware her name would be relevant to..." "Her name wasn't raised." The administrator put his glasses back on. "I was simply noting the mention." The meeting continued for another 20 minutes. By its end, a follow-up had been scheduled. Nothing had been agreed, but nothing had been refused, and in the world both men occupied, the absence of refusal was itself a kind of currency. Tae-sung left the 38th floor with the sensation, familiar, reassuring, of a meeting that had gone as planned. He did not notice that the administrator, once the elevator doors had closed, sat very still for a moment before reaching for his phone. Did not notice the brief call that lasted 45 seconds. Did not notice, as he crossed the lobby and moved through the revolving doors into the afternoon, that the quality of the silence he left behind him had changed. Little did he know that, at that exact moment, in the penthouse that did not exist on any public directory, a conversation had already begun about him. The 42nd floor was, in its way, the truest room in the building. Everything below it performed wealth. The marble, the filtered air, the carpets that ate sound. The 42nd floor did not perform anything. It simply was. The furnishings were sparse and deliberate. Dark wood, low surfaces, a single long window that ran the entire southern wall and looked out over Seoul with the quiet authority of something that has been watching for a very long time. There were no decorative objects, no artwork on the walls. The only things on the central table were a laptop, a glass of water, and a phone placed face down. Jang Hyun-woo stood at the window with his back to the room. He was not a large man in the way that the word large suggests bulk or aggression. He was large in the way that certain silences are large, in the way he occupied space, in the way the room's atmosphere organized itself around his stillness. He wore a charcoal suit, 2 buttons open at the collar, the dark lines of the tattoo on his neck just visible above the fabric. The dragon that climbed from his shoulder, wound past his collarbone, and ended at the jaw in a pattern that his enemies had learned to associate with the specific calm that preceded catastrophic decisions. He was not calm now. He was something more complex than calm. Beside the table, a man Taesung had never met and would never be told about, was delivering a brief account of the corridor interaction. No embellishment, chronological, precise. The kind of report trained by years of understanding exactly what Hyun-woo needed to hear and exactly what he could be trusted to infer on his own. When the report ended, there was a silence. "She didn't react," Hyun-woo said. It was not a question. "No." She apologized and continued. Another silence. Then, "Good." He turned from the window. His eyes, dark, deeply set, the kind of eyes that registered everything and returned nothing, moved to the phone on the table. "The meeting on 38. How did he present himself?" "As expected. The family needs the association. He knows it. He's performing confidence to obscure the ask." Hyun-woo pulled the chair out from the table and sat. He did not pick up the phone. He looked at it for a moment as though it had said something he was considering whether to answer. "Scheduled dinner. Penthouse. Tonight." The other man paused. Not from surprise, because surprise was a response this room did not encourage, but from the brief computational pause of someone adjusting a series of arrangements in real time. "The 38th floor protocol suggests a second. I know what it suggests." Silence. "Tonight," Hyun-woo said again, quietly. The word the way he said most words, without emphasis, which was itself a form of emphasis. The other man nodded and left. Hyun-woo remained at the table. He reached for the glass of water, drank, set it down. In the corridor 11 floors below him, at this exact moment, Celine was finishing the east wing, moving the cart into the service alcove, removing her gloves with the practiced efficiency of someone who does everything with precisely the amount of effort it requires, and not a fraction more. The golden clip in her hair caught the alcove light. She had not told him about the corridor. She had not needed to. She had known, the moment she saw the security officer reach for his radio, that the building's nervous system would carry the information upward faster than any message she could send. She knew, also, what the information would produce in him. Not rage. She had seen his rage once, early in their marriage, directed at a man who had made a genuine threat against her. It had been quiet and total, and she had understood in that moment that she had married someone whose emotional interior was structured in the opposite way from most people she had known. The closer something came to the center of what he cared about, the quieter he became. The rage compressed inward rather than outward. It became something harder and more durable than anger. It became decision. She finished securing the alcove, pulled out her phone, a secondary device plainly cased unremarkable, and read the message that had arrived 4 minutes ago. Dinner. Tonight. 42. She read it once, put the phone away, picked up the golden clip which had slipped slightly during the alcove work, and refastened it. She looked at her reflection in the small mirror mounted above the service sink. The woman in the uniform looked back at her with calm, honey-brown eyes. She allowed herself, in the privacy of the alcove, the full version of the smile she had given Kwon Tae-sung in the corridor. Then she turned off the light and went back to work. The city changed its face at night. Seoul after dark was not a dimming of what existed in daylight. It was a replacement. The rivers of pedestrian traffic that filled the streets at noon thinned and redistributed into different channels. The restaurant floors, the private rooms of establishments that had no signs outside their doors. The back seats of cars moving between buildings whose purposes were never listed in any registry. The city did not sleep. It simply rerouted itself into arrangements that daylight made inconvenient. The Park Hanam complex changed too. The lobby, which in daylight hummed with the low-frequency energy of people arriving and departing with purpose, became at night a space of selective traffic. Fewer people, each one more deliberate. The concierge acknowledged entrances with smaller gestures, the nods of someone who knows that the people passing at this hour do not require the performance of hospitality. Kwon Tae-sung arrived at 8:47. He had dressed with the specific care of a man who understood that tonight was not the same meeting as this afternoon. That this invitation to dinner in the penthouse represented a shift in register that demanded a different presentation. He had changed into a deeper suit, charcoal rather than navy, and had removed the pocket square entirely. An instinct toward understatement that was, if he had known it, the first genuinely correct reading he had made all day. His 2 assistants had been told to wait in the car. This instruction had been delivered to him by a short message from the building's administrative line 3 hours earlier, and it had produced in him a particular quality of discomfort. The discomfort of a man accustomed to being surrounded by people whose function is to make him feel consequential, suddenly asked to walk into an unfamiliar room without that architecture around him. He had not mentioned the discomfort to his assistants. He had not mentioned it to anyone. He had straightened his collar in the car mirror and reminded himself that he was a Kwon, and that Kwons did not arrive anywhere uncertain. He crossed the lobby. The concierge looked up briefly and then looked away, which was itself a form of instruction. A different security officer from the one stationed at the door earlier in the day appeared at his left shoulder without announcement and walked him to a separate elevator bank at the far end of the lobby. Not the elevators Tae-sung had used that afternoon. These were set back from the main corridor behind a panel of dark glass that, until the officer approached it, had appeared to be a wall. Inside, the officer pressed the matte black card to the panel. A floor number appeared on the display above the doors. 42. Then disappeared. Tae-sung watched it go, said nothing, fixed his eyes on the middle distance in the way that people fix their eyes on the middle distance when they are working very hard not to appear affected by something. The elevator rose. The doors opened into a space that recalibrated his expectations so thoroughly and so immediately that he needed a full 2 seconds at the threshold before he could move. He had anticipated something designed to impress, the way the 38th floor meeting suite had been designed to impress, with its walnut panels and its positioned lighting and its table set for an audience. He had prepared, without quite knowing he was preparing, for the experience of being shown power. What he found instead was a room that did not appear to care whether he was impressed or not. The floor was dark stone. The walls on 3 sides were matte, bare, the color of deep water at dusk. The 4th wall, the entire southern face of the building, was glass, floor to ceiling, uninterrupted, and through it, soul spread outward in every direction like a circuit board lit from within, the river a dark ribbon dividing the light. The ceiling was low enough to feel intimate despite the room's scale. The furniture was sparse, a long, low table of pale wood set for 3, a single overhead light above it that pooled warmth onto the place settings and left the edges of the room in a dimness that was clearly deliberate. There were 2 people in the room. Taesung saw the man first. Jang Hyun-woo stood at the far end of the table, not quite seated, one hand resting on the back of his chair. The posture of a man who had decided to remain standing until something was established. The charcoal suit, the open collar, the tattoo visible above the fabric, the dragon's scaled neck catching the low light. He was looking at Taesung with the complete, unblinking attention of someone who has already completed their assessment and is now simply waiting for the subject to confirm it. Taesung had encountered powerful men before. He had grown up surrounded by them, had sat at tables with ministers and prosecutors and men whose names appeared on the covers of magazines and the fronts of buildings. He understood the grammar of power as it was usually performed. The expansiveness, the ease, the deliberate signals of a man who needs you to know at all times that he is relaxed because he is in control. Hyun-woo performed none of this. He simply stood there, still, and the room arranged itself around his stillness as though it had always been designed for exactly this purpose. It was the woman that Taesung saw second. She was standing near the window, slightly to the left of Hyun-woo's position, speaking quietly to someone, a staff member, it appeared, who was receiving a brief instruction and nodding. Her back was partly to the room. Her hair was down. Taesung registered several things in rapid and uncomfortable succession. The hair, natural, enormous, perfect, was the hair of the woman in the corridor. The posture, that particular quality of uprightness, of a body that had never learned to make itself smaller in a room, was the posture of the woman in the corridor. The golden clip was gone, because the hair was down, but the absence of it was somehow more recognizable than its presence had been. And the dress, long, black, minimal. The kind of garment that exists not to draw attention to itself, but to draw attention, with complete efficiency, to the person wearing it. At the base of her throat, a gold chain so fine it was almost invisible, caught the light when she turned. She turned. The honey-brown eyes found him with the same quality of attention she had given him that morning. Unhurried, complete, carrying the faint and unreadable suggestion of someone who has known the ending of a story for quite some time and is waiting with genuine patience for the other characters to catch up. Taesung's mouth opened slightly, closed. In the silence of that moment, with the city burning quietly beyond the glass behind her, he understood. Not yet fully, not yet with all the implications arranged and accounted for, but at the foundational level at which understanding sometimes arrives before the mind can construct the language for it. That he had made an error this morning. Not a social error, not a question of manners. Something structural. Something that had, in the hours since he pressed the elevator button in the lobby and fixed his eyes on the middle distance and reminded himself he was a Quan, been quietly and irrevocably changing shape. Hyun-woo spoke first. His voice was exactly as his posture suggested it would be. Low, even, carrying the particular quality of a man who has never once needed to raise it to be heard. Sit down. Not, please sit. Not, welcome. 2 words delivered without performance, which nonetheless contained within them the complete geography of the room and everyone's position in it. Taesung sat. The dinner lasted 40 minutes. It was served by 2 staff members who moved in and out of the room with the trained silence of people who understood that their presence was a logistical function rather than a social one. The food was simple, far simpler than Taesung had expected. Grilled fish, rice, a cold broth with vegetables that had been prepared with obvious care but presented without ceremony. Hyunwoo ate slowly and talked very little during the meal. He asked 2 questions, about the specific timeline the Kwon family was working within, and about which of the family's current relationships had already proven insufficient. Both questions were asked with the tone of someone confirming information they already possess, rather than seeking information they lack. Taesung answered. He heard himself answering. He heard the confidence in his own voice and recognized it for the first time as a sound he was producing rather than a state he was inhabiting. Across the table, Celine ate with the same unhurried precision she applied to everything. She did not look at Taesung with hostility. She did not look at him with coldness. She looked at him, when she looked at him at all, with the quality of attention a person gives to something that is temporarily relevant, present, noted, not particularly important. This was worse than coldness. Taesung understood this without being able to explain it. It was after the plates had been cleared, after the staff had withdrawn and the 3 of them sat in the quiet of the room with the city's light shifting slowly beyond the glass, that Hyunwoo set his hands flat on the table. Not a threatening gesture, a settling one. The gesture of a man who has been waiting for the meal to end so that what actually needed to be said could be said. You came here, Hyunwoo began, because your family's position has become uncertain. You need an association that restores what you've lost. He paused. That's the accurate version of why you're in this room. Taesung said nothing, which was, in its way, the most honest answer he had given all day. I'm willing to consider it, Hyunwoo continued. The Kwon name still has weight in certain places we find useful. Another pause. But before we discuss terms, there's something that needs to be addressed. He did not look at Celine when he said it. He did not need to. Taesung looked at her instead, and found her already looking at him. With that patience, that completeness, the faint architecture of the smile she had given him in the corridor that morning. His stomach dropped in the slow, specific way of a man who has just understood that the ground he thought he was standing on was never ground at all. The word came out before he had decided to speak. He stopped, tried again. She works here. This morning she doesn't work here, Hyunwoo said. The city glittered beyond the glass. The overhead light held its small pool of warmth over the pale wood table. Somewhere far below, Seoul continued its rerouted nighttime life, indifferent and magnificent. She is my wife. The words landed in the room the way certain truths land, not with the violence of a collision, but with the quiet, total weight of something that has always been true, finally being said aloud. Not a revelation so much as a reclassification. The furniture did not move. The light did not change. The city beyond the glass continued its indifferent shimmer. And yet the room was, in every way that mattered, a completely different room than it had been 4 seconds earlier. Kwon Taesung did not speak. This was not a strategic silence. It was not the considered pause of a man choosing his next words carefully. It was the silence of a man whose internal architecture, the framework of assumptions and hierarchies and instinctive readings of rooms that had been constructed over 33 years and had never once, in any meaningful way, failed him, had just been presented with information it did not have a structure to receive. He looked at Celine. She looked back at him with those honey-brown eyes, and the patience in them was now something he could read more precisely than he had been able to that morning. It was not the patience of someone waiting for an outcome. It was the patience of someone who had already lived through the outcome many times in their mind and had long since made their peace with it. She was not watching him understand. She was watching him catch up to something she had known since the moment he opened his mouth in the corridor. You were... He stopped. The sentence had no functional ending. Cleaning the 41st floor corridor, she said. Her voice was the same as it had been that morning. Low, even, carrying no excess weight. Yes. But you... am his wife. The same tone. Not completing his sentences out of unkindness, completing them out of efficiency. The way a person who has very little interest in prolonging a particular kind of confusion moves it toward resolution. Taesung turned to Hyunwoo. A mistake. Not because Hyunwoo was dangerous in this moment, though he was, but because what Taesung was looking for in that face was some form of softening, some signal that the situation contained more flexibility than it appeared to. What he found instead were those dark, unblinking eyes and the absolute stillness of a man who had decided the shape of this evening several hours ago and was now simply present while it took that shape. I didn't know, Taesung said. I know you didn't, Hyunwoo replied. Another silence. This one different in texture. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of a conversation that has arrived at its actual subject and is taking a moment to acknowledge the arrival. That, Hyunwoo continued, is the problem. He stood, not abruptly, with the same unhurried quality that characterized everything he did. The movement of a man for whom urgency has always been a choice rather than a reflex. He buttoned the single middle button of his jacket and walked to the window. Stood there with his back to the room, looking at the city the way he had looked at it earlier that day, and the day before, and every day for 6 years in this building, with the particular attention of someone who has learned to read a thing by watching it from a height. You came here tonight, he said, to ask for protection, to attach your family's name to ours in a way that restores something you've been quietly losing. He paused. And this morning, before that meeting, before that request, before you sat in the 38th floor suite and performed confidence at my administrator, you stood in my corridor and told my wife that she was only good for one thing, that she should watch where she was going, that she was nothing beyond her function. The city absorbed his words, returned nothing. You didn't know who she was, he continued. I understand that. But I want you to sit with the more important question, which is this. What did you think you knew? What did you see when you looked at her that made you certain enough to speak that way? Taesung had no answer. Not because the question was unanswerable, but because every available answer was, he now understood with cold clarity, worse than silence. Hyunwoo turned from the window. You saw a uniform. You saw a woman in a uniform who was black and who was holding a cleaning cart. And from those two facts, you constructed an entire architecture. Who she was, what she was worth, how she should be spoken to, what she was owed. He walked back to the table, did not sit, stood at the end of it with both hands in his pockets, looking at Taesung with the expression of a man delivering a verdict he finds neither satisfying nor regrettable. Simply accurate. That architecture is the problem, not the words you used. the structure underneath them. Taesung's jaw was tight. He was a man who had not been spoken to this way before. Not in a room like this. Not by a person whose position made the words land with the weight they were landing with now. He wanted to push back. He could feel the instinct rising in him, the trained reflex of a man who had been told his entire life that his name was a form of armor. He looked at Celine. She was watching him with an expression he could not fully decode, which he was beginning to understand was a permanent condition of being looked at by her. There was no cruelty in it. There was no satisfaction of the kind he might have expected from a person who had been insulted and was now watching the insulter brought low. There was instead something that disturbed him more deeply than either of those things would have. There was interest. She was watching him the way a person watches something they find genuinely worth observing. As though his discomfort was not the point of the evening, but was, incidentally, revealing something she found worth noting. She reached to the side table beside her chair, a low surface he had not focused on when he entered, and lifted an envelope. Plain, unsealed. She set it on the pale wood table between them and pushed it forward with 2 fingers, a small and precise movement, and then folded her hands in her lap and returned to watching him. "What is this?" he said. Not quite a question. "Open it." He did. Inside were 4 pages. He read the first one slowly, then faster, and then he set it down and looked up at her with an expression that had finally moved beyond calculation into something rawer and more honest than anything he had shown that evening. The pages contained a complete account of every protection arrangement the Kwan family currently maintained. The contracts, the informal agreements, the names of the intermediaries, the dates and the sums and the specific services being provided and by whom. Information that should have been held by no more than 3 people in the Kwan family's inner circle. Information that a person with the right access, the right contacts, and the right patience could have assembled. But that had never, to Taesung's knowledge, been assembled in one place on 4 clean pages, presented in plain language across a table in a penthouse in Seoul. How? The second page, Celine said. He turned it, read. The second page outlined with the same clean precision the alternative infrastructure, the network of relationships and arrangements that the organization had quietly built over the preceding 18 months to render the Kwan family's existing protection entirely replaceable. Not as a threat. The document did not read as a threat. It read as a statement of fact, the way a balance sheet reads as a statement of fact. This is what exists. This is what it means. These are the implications. The third page was a proposed arrangement. Terms. Specific, reasonable, and structured in a way that made clear they had been designed by someone who understood not only the Kwan family's current needs, but their future vulnerabilities. The ones they had not yet identified themselves. The 4th page was blank. The 4th page, Celine said, is for your signature. If you agree to the terms on page 3. She paused. You can take all 4 pages with you tonight. There's no deadline, but I'd suggest you don't take longer than a week. The alternative on page 2 doesn't require your participation to become operational. It simply becomes more relevant the longer the current arrangement remains unresolved. Taesung looked at her for a long moment. You prepared this, he said. Yes. Before tonight. Long before tonight. He set the pages down. Something had shifted in him over the course of the last several minutes. Not a softening exactly, but a recalibration of the kind that happens when a person's model of a situation is replaced, rapidly and without their consent, by a more accurate one. He was still the same man who had walked into the lobby with his Milan suit and his fixed hair and his performed confidence. But he was that man sitting across from a woman who had, in 6 months of corridor work and 4 months of Zurich offices and a decade of carefully assembled relationships across 3 continents, built the architecture that currently held his family's future in its structure. And who had, that morning, accepted his contempt with 2 words and a half smile, and continued down the corridor pushing a cleaning cart. "Why?" he asked. The question surprised him as it left his mouth. It was more honest than he had intended. Celine looked at him for a moment. Then she glanced at Hyun-woo, who was watching her with those dark eyes and the expression he reserved for moments when she said things he already knew, but wanted to hear her say. She looked back at Tae-sung. "Because respect is not optional," she said. "It never was. Most people just haven't had someone explain it to them in a language they could hear." She stood. The dress moved with her, the gold chain catching the light at her throat. She was not leaving. She was simply done sitting. She moved to the window and stood where Hyun-woo had stood, looking out at Seoul with the same quality of attention, the same ownership of the view, the same absolute absence of any need for the room's approval. Hyun-woo remained at the table. He looked at Tae-sung with the expression of a man who has said everything he intended to say, and is now simply waiting for the other person to complete their own process. "Take the pages," he said. "Think about what you want to do." Tae-sung gathered the 4 pages, folded them once, carefully, and placed them inside his jacket. He stood, straightened. He looked for something to say, something that would allow him to leave the room as a version of himself that had not been entirely revised by the last 40 minutes. He found nothing. He nodded once, to Hyun-woo, and then, with a deliberateness that cost him something, to Celine's reflection in the dark glass of the window. She did not turn around, but in the glass he saw the faint curve at the corner of her mouth. The same curve as the corridor. The same patience. The same knowing. He walked to the elevator. The doors opened without a sound. He stepped inside. The display above the doors showed 42 for one brief moment, and then nothing. The doors closed. In the penthouse, the silence resettled itself like water finding its level. Hyun-woo moved to stand beside Celine at the window. He did not touch her immediately. He stood beside her for a moment, looking at the same city, sharing the same view. "He'll sign," she said. "I know. He'll also treat the next person in a uniform differently." Hyun-woo considered this. "You think so?" Celine was quiet for a moment. "No," she said, with an honesty that was somehow also, in its way, kind. "But he'll think about it. And that's where it starts." Hyun-woo reached up and touched the golden clip she had returned to her hair. She had pinned it back before dinner, a small and private ritual, with one finger. Barely a touch. The gesture of a man who has learned that the things he values most require almost no force to acknowledge. She leaned slightly into his shoulder. Just slightly. The city burned below them, indifferent and endless. All those lit windows holding all those lives that would wake tomorrow and move through the world reading surfaces, trusting uniforms, deciding in the first half-second of every encounter who was worth seeing and who was not. "When are you going to stop?" he asked quietly. The question he always asked. The question whose answer he already knew. She smiled, the full version, the one only this room received. "When it stops being necessary," she said. Below them, in the lobby, Kwon Tae-sung walked through the revolving doors into the Seoul night. His assistants straightened when they saw him approach the car. He did not speak on the drive home. He held the folded pages inside his jacket with one hand, flat against his chest, and looked out the window at the city moving past. At one point, stopped at a light, a woman crossed in front of the car, middle-aged, carrying bags, moving with the tired efficiency of someone at the end of a long day. His eyes passed over her in the automatic way that eyes pass over the unremarkable. Then, for just a moment, a fraction of a second, a hesitation so brief his assistants did not notice it. He looked again. The light changed. The car moved forward. It was not redemption. It was not transformation. It was one small, almost invisible fracture in the architecture of a habit that had never before been questioned, which is, almost always, exactly where everything begins. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever been dismissed by someone who looked at the surface of you and decided, in that single careless second, that they already knew everything you were worth? Have you ever had to choose between correcting someone's assumption and letting them walk toward the truth on their own? And to those of you who have ever been the one doing the dismissing, not out of cruelty, but out of habit, out of a lifetime of never being asked to look twice, what would it take for you to look again? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, hidden strength, and the kind of justice that arrives quietly and changes everything, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.